Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. In today's world, the most popular weapon of choice in warfare is obviously the firearm. Guns come in many different forms today, including pistols, machine guns, rifles, and other forms of artillery. But for the majority of human history, guns were not the main weapon of warfare. In fact, throughout the history of war, one weapon has traversed the scope of human history and permeated virtually all cultures, and even today, variations of it are still used in certain combat situations. This is what's known as the king of weapons in warfare, the sword. So the sword's origin story is found in the knife and dagger, tools that have been used since the beginning of time. In very ancient times, these tools were used for cutting and carving food and shelter, and eventually they found a use in warfare as well. Now we go back 5,000 years to where the first swords began to take shape as people realized how effective knives and daggers could be on the battlefield if they were just a little bit longer. So we have the introduction of the sword in battle. Now, in the Near East, certain cultural trends began to develop in the making of the sword. Greek and Roman swords tended to be shorter in length, but straight and two-edged. Further in the East, we begin to see the development of the curved sword, which would become the dominant weapon in medieval Islam, but that comes a little later. Now, speaking of the Middle Ages, it was here in the West that we see the sword reach its high watermark in weaponry on the field of battle. As the art of knighthood and cavalry grew, soldiers began to realize they needed longer, more powerful and strong weapons to defeat their foes. So in the High Middle Ages, we see the introduction of the two-handed broadsword, a massive weapon that gave the wielder both a long reach and the potential for maximum damage, with each thrust and slash. This is also where we see the high watermark of hand-to-hand combat in warfare, because in the East, technological advancements were being made in the High Middle Ages that would change warfare forever. This would come with the introduction of gunpowder in warfare. We've explored this in another moment in history, and it would reach Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. Still, the rise of guns and cannons did not completely eradicate the sword. Throughout the early modern period, that's roughly the 15th to the 18th centuries, many soldiers still carried swords with them and prepared for hand-to-hand combat, knowing, for example, that they would eventually run out of ammo, or understanding that their firearms could often misfire. So in this time period, we see the introduction of the rapier. Now that's a thin sword with an extravagant hilt used mainly for dueling and somewhat for decoration as well. So we go into the 20th century where the sword has diminished to mainly the sport of fencing and play acting, but still even today, soldiers in all cultures are taught hand-to-hand combat with a sharp blade. Now the sword may not be the preeminent weapon of choice as it was 600 years ago and before, but until the Lord returns and warfare is no more, I suspect the sword will always be in use, at least on some level. Thanks so much for joining me once again for A Moment in History.